Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world, one book at a time.
Today, we're diving deep into Taylor Branch's monumental second volume of his trilogy on the King years, Pillar of Fire. America in the King years, 1963-65.
And this isn't just a history lesson. This is really a masterclass in how institutional change actually happens.
Yes.
We often talk about the civil rights movement with this, very tidy, simple moral narrative.
Right. The story of Dr. King leading the nation to a moral awakening.
Exactly. But Branch's work, it just forces you to see that period,
Huh.
from 63 to 65, not as some kind of morality play, but as a systemic confrontation, a violent clash where law, morality, and these deeply entrenched power structures were colliding.
It was a crucible. There's no other word for it. This 2-year span was a profound structural breaking point in American democracy. And Branch, he meticulously documents how that pressure forced every major institution to change.
Everyone.
Every single one. The White House, Congress, the FBI, local police forces, even the national media, they all had to fundamentally change their behavior or, frankly, face destruction through sheer contradiction.
So our mission for you today is to get right into that systems level. We want to analyze the mechanics of how this change was engineered. We're moving way beyond biographical tributes to really understand the institutional roles of, say, the federal government, the grassroots movements, and the brutal use of state power during this incredibly kinetic phase.
And to set the stage, we should really appreciate the historian we're working with here. Taylor Branch is one of the masters of the era. Pillar of Fire follows his Pulitzer Prize-winning first volume, Parting the Waters.
And his gift is the methodology, right? The sheer depth of the research.
Oh, absolutely. He spent years on this. We're talking nearly 2,000 interviews. And that allowed him to penetrate the most obscure corners of the past, linking the quiet, incredibly dangerous work of local organizers directly to the highest political decisions being made in Washington.
That level of detail is just so critical because it completely dismantles the myth that this change was simple or inevitable. Branch argues that this specific period, 63 to 65, was defined by tides that crested. So what was it? What made these 2 years the absolute, undeniable, critical window for systemic change?
It was the intensity, the sustained pitch of the challenge. The movement was demanding that America address the fundamental meaning of words like dignity, equal votes, equal souls, and to do it right now with no compromise.
And the action that kicks this whole volume off is the Birmingham campaign in May 1963. Branch calls it a miracle.
It was a miracle, but also a desperate, calculated leap.
A leap because King was struggling at that point, wasn't he?
Precisely. Post-Albany in 1962, King had been branded a failure. Segregation was still firmly in place there. The key to Birmingham was the moral witness of the participants, and this is the crucial part, which included school children, down to first and second graders, volunteering to face police dogs and fire hoses. There was just no historical precedent for that level of civic courage and, importantly, strategic planning.
So you have children, literally children, turning the power balance of a deeply segregated nation upside down. Not with money, not with military force, but with pure, visible, moral confrontation. That's an almost unimaginable concept for a system that's just designed to resist change.
And the sheer visibility of it, amplified by mass media, and the extremity of the confrontation with Police Commissioner Bull Connor, it forced the federal government to confront the deep, inherent, and frankly embarrassing contradictions in its own laws.
Right.
And this gets us right to the foundation of Branch's central thesis, which really guides our whole analysis today. Civil rights progress did not emerge from some spontaneous, gradual moral consensus.
The system was too entrenched for that.
Far too entrenched. Instead, progress only resulted from sustained, calculated pressure applied directly to institutions that were, in his words, designed to resist change.
So the system's default setting was resistance. And only massive, public, and dangerous disruption could alter the incentives for those in power. Let's start with the mechanism King chose for that disruption. Nonviolence as a strategic system, not just a moral posture.
King's move to Birmingham was that calculated gamble we mentioned. It followed the painful failure of the Albany campaign and a really significant schism within the National Baptist Convention. He was actually excommunicated by the convention president.
So he needed a win, a visible win.
He desperately needed one to restore his credibility and, the SCLC's funding power.
And he didn't pick Birmingham by accident. It was known as the symbolic bastion of segregation. Why was that deliberate choice so important to the strategy?
It was all about forcing a public drama. King realized that all the dignified, legal routes to change were either closed or just moving way too slowly. Birmingham was about taking the initiative and forcing a high-stakes, globally visible showdown with Bull Connor, who was, infamous for his volatility and brutality.
The goal wasn't to change Bull Connor's heart.
Not at all. The goal was to expose the system that Bull Connor represented to the entire world.
It was a conscious decision to embrace the public spectacle of what they called unmerited suffering. Branch makes it really clear that King and his colleagues learned that this suffering was the surest, maybe the swiftest, messenger to break through to guarded or disinterested strangers.
Meaning the Northern white audience, the federal government, and, so critically, the global community watching the Cold War rivalry unfold.
Wow.
And the preparation for this strategy, it just reveals the depth of the calculation. King warned his friends at the retreat where they planned the campaign that, and this is a quote, "Some of the people sitting here today will not come back alive from this campaign."
So this wasn't just a protest.
This was a nonviolent war. It had an expected casualty count, and it was designed explicitly to generate irresistible external pressure that the political structure could no longer afford to ignore.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because this strategic commitment to nonviolence immediately drew fire from competing systems of resistance. I'm thinking specifically of the Black nationalist movement, the Nation of Islam, and of course, Malcolm X.
Oh, absolutely. Malcolm X, who was already the national minister for the NOI, had been criticizing nonviolence since the Montgomery bus boycott, calling it passive resistance.
He ridiculed it.
Publicly, he mocked the idea of a movement built on sit-ins. He famously said, "Anybody can sit. A coward can sit. It takes a man to stand."
He was cultivating a very deliberate aura of violence. I remember reading his boast that if someone mistook a Muslim for a nonviolent advocate and laid hands on them, "We'll put you to death just like that." This wasn't just talk, was it?
No, it was a completely different philosophical and systemic approach to confrontation, one that sought to meet violence with equal or even superior force.
And the internal tensions within the NOI system around that very policy became really visible in 1962 after the Los Angeles Stokes shooting.
Yes, where police officers shot 7 unarmed Muslims, killing 1, Ronald X. Stokes. Malcolm X flew out there immediately, and he was ready for a sanctioned, bloody retaliation against the police. He felt the moment demanded an honest Muslim response and was fully expecting bloodshed.
But the rigid internal structure of the NOI, it blocked that response, which really reveals the complexity of their own systemic controls, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Strict orders came down directly from Elijah Muhammad. No retribution. He told them, "Play dead on everything." And Malcolm obeyed, but he was furious. He chafed at it. He lost face among his critics, who pointed out he just looked passively to God after an all-white jury ruled the killing justifiable.
So even the NOI, with its image of militancy, had its own internal system of control that demanded strategic withdrawal, just like King's movement.
For different reasons, but yes. It shows that even systems that cultivate an external image of uncompromising militancy have their own internal checks and balances.
Okay, so that external strategy, forcing a crisis through suffering, was immediately complicated by the very entity the activists were trying to influence, the federal government. Which brings us to the second major system in play here, federal law enforcement's profound ambivalence and its systemic surveillance.
The FBI was operating a dual system, and it was a devastating contradiction. On one hand, you have them notoriously ignoring or just standing apart from this horrific violence against civil rights workers, claiming it's a local police matter.
Right.
But on the other hand, they were simultaneously conducting relentless, invasive surveillance against the movement leaders themselves, particularly King and the NOI.
Let's look at the Nation of Islam first. The FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, against the NOI began in late 1962. It had a very specific goal, didn't it?
It did. And you have to remember, the FBI had wiretaps on Elijah Muhammad going all the way back to 1957. Internally, the FBI described COINTELPRO as operating on the highest possible plane, but in reality, they were exploiting the most deeply held personal secrets within the organization to try and fracture it.
How so?
Branch details how the FBI had gathered all this knowledge of Elijah Muhammad's illegitimate children and just used it as ammunition. They sent anonymous, accusing letters laced with 2 years' worth of salacious details directly to his inner circle.
Wow.
And their stated intention was to generate extreme discontent and cause Malcolm X to fall into disfavor.
So they weren't just observing. They were actively trying to destabilize and fracture the organization using personal scandal as a weapon. And what was the comparable operation against King during this same period?
King was simultaneously under intense and increasing FBI surveillance authorized at the highest levels. Branch documents that an FBI witness later testified in a Texas courtroom that the call King took from Muhammad Ali on September 4th, 1964, was captured on a wiretap placed on King himself.
And that was the first official acknowledgement of this.
The first one, proving the depth of the government's distrust.
Wait. So the individual who is forcing the nation to confront its legal and moral contradictions, who is risking his life to uphold the spirit of the Constitution, is at the very same time being treated by a branch of that same government as a subversive entity to be undermined and surveilled. I mean, how did King even begin to reconcile that ruthless political calculation?
Well, that political calculation often superseded King's fundamental need for protection and advice. A critical example is the forced banishment of Stanley Levison.
His trusted advisor and friend.
Yes, forced out of his inner circle due to immense, sustained FBI pressure, all stemming from accusations of communist ties.
That seems like an extraordinary price to pay just for political access.
It was. But the pragmatic argument given to King was that the Kennedys, and later Johnson, were trying to balance the government among power politicians, not moral theorists. The message was clear. Levison's head was a small, necessary price to pay if they wanted the political machinery of the state to eventually move against segregation.
It just illustrates how the federal system prioritized its own political stability over the moral security of its allies.
And the most painful illustration of this systemic ambivalence, I think, comes out of Mississippi during Freedom Summer in 1964.
Right.
Branch highlights this truly chilling reality conveyed by John Doerr, the Justice Department official, to the hundreds of Freedom Summer volunteers. This was after the disappearance of the 3 workers, Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman.
So the threat was known. It was real.
Absolutely real. And despite that, Doerr warned them unequivocally they should count on 0 federal protection.
So they were told to be moral witnesses, to risk everything for the right to vote, but the federal government would not act as a police force to guarantee their safety against local violence. This brings us right to our third major mechanism. Local violence wasn't just random bigotry, it was an enforcement system.
Exactly. Local power structures used terror as a predictable, institutionalized system to maintain the racial hierarchy, especially when the veneer of law was being chipped away by federal courts. Just look at the stories from Amite County, Mississippi. Lewis Allen, a logger, was murdered in 1964.
And why was he killed?
Simply because he had witnessed the execution of an activist named Herbert Lee all the way back in 1961.
He was killed 3 years later, just for observing an earlier crime.
And for talking about it, Allen was explicitly targeted as the tip-off man for the integration-minded Justice Department. This shows you that the local system viewed cooperating with Washington as a capital offense. It was treason against the local structure, punishable by death.
And the brutality wasn't just from extra-legal groups like the Klan. It was casual, institutional, and systematic, carried out by official law enforcement.
The brutal treatment of Fannie Lou Hamer and Annell Ponder in Winona, Mississippi in 1963 is visceral proof of this. Ponder, who had trained with civil rights icon Septima Clark, and Hamer were arrested at a bus stop. Ponder had politely led her group to the white side of the cafe and had the audacity to object to the slurs they received.
But she was following the law, the federal law, regarding interstate travel, right? She wasn't staging some radical protest.
That is the horrifying point. She was following the rules, and yet the local police and highway patrolmen felt utterly entitled to inflict systemic violence simply because she followed the rules, and critically, because she took notes on the names and tag numbers of the officers.
Documentation itself was a threat.
A threat that they believed deserved immediate and painful eradication. Branch recounts Hamer describing being beaten with a blackjack until she couldn't feel her own limbs, while other arrested activists were forced to beat her.
And even when activists were released from notorious places like Parchman Penitentiary, the system's goal was still degradation. It was institutional humiliation.
Yes, the system was designed to break the spirit, not just punish a legal infraction. When the Greenwood leaders were taken to Parchman, they were greeted expressly as people who needed to be physically and mentally broken. They were forcibly shorn of all their hair, slathered with this bluish delousing grease, and then crammed into tiny isolation cells.
The sweat box.
The sweat box, 6 feet square, no lights, no windows. This methodical degradation enforced by the state correctional system served the primary institutional purpose of crushing dissent.
The constant, unrelenting pressure of all this, from external violence, from federal ambivalence, from internal exhaustion, it inevitably created deep fractures within the movement itself. Let's talk about those internal struggles over strategy and identity. That's our fourth systemic insight.
Branch meticulously details the intense friction between SCLC, King's organization, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They just had fundamentally different systemic approaches. SNCC, led by figures like Bob Moses, favored this low-key, sustained, incredibly dangerous voter registration work at the local grassroots level.
So a slower, more dangerous, but maybe a more deeply rooted form of change.
It was. SCLC, on the other hand, required celebrity leadership, King's presence, to draw national attention and, crucially, massive funds from Northern donors. The SNCC veterans often saw King's approach as distracting from that slow, essential groundwork.
And this structural tension, it also extended to the makeup of the movement, especially during Freedom Summer, when hundreds of white volunteers came down to Mississippi.
Absolutely. There were deep tensions over integrating the movement. SNCC staff, particularly Black student leaders like Charlie Cobb, sometimes considered the white volunteers more trouble than they were worth, arrogant and yet naive about the dangers and the structural racism they were facing.
So there's this philosophical divide.
A huge one. The internal struggle within SNCC was largely defined as one between the power hardliners like James Forman, who focused on organizing mass power, and the floater existentialists like Moses, who believed the true organic anchor of the movement came from the people themselves, not centralized leadership.
And while all this is happening, the Nation of Islam is having its own critical schism between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, a power struggle that becomes highly visible right when the movement needed cohesion most.
It was multi-layered. It started with Malcolm X chafing at that organizational passivity after the Stokes shooting, but it deepened over religious orthodoxy. Specifically, Elijah's son questioning the divinity of the founder, and, most damagingly, accusations of corruption centered on Elijah Muhammad's illegitimate children.
So the internal structural integrity of the Nation of Islam is crumbling right as Malcolm X is gaining massive external traction as this radical voice.
It shows that even structures that seem monolithic have to fight for coherence under pressure. The NOI's internal crisis ultimately pushed Malcolm X to break free, seek Orthodox Islam, and refocus his political critique on systemic oppression rather than theological purity.
Let's pivot now to the visibility system. How did media exposure act as the lever that reshaped the federal government's incentives? This is our fifth point, the law of public attention.
The media acted as a crucial, though sometimes reluctant, vanguard of visibility. They often unintentionally forced a national crisis. And the most system-defining example of the media's role isn't a news report. It's actually the landmark Supreme Court case, New York Times v. Sullivan, in 1964.
That case established the actual malice standard, which seems, purely about the First Amendment. But Branch makes it clear it began as a systemic attack on the civil rights movement.
It was an attempt at financial repression, plain and simple. The case stemmed from a small, factually inaccurate advertisement about the movement placed in the Times. Alabama officials sued the New York Times for libel and won an initial $500,000 judgment.
$500,000 in 1964. That's an attempt to bankrupt the paper and, more importantly, create a chilling precedent.
Exactly. This was a naked, systemic attempt by a state institution to financially repress civil rights coverage. If the Times lost, every newspaper covering the Deep South could face ruinous lawsuits, which would effectively silence the national press on the issue.
But the Supreme Court's unanimous response created the actual malice standard for public figures, raising attention, as Branch puts it, permanently above its origins in concerted racial repression. The irony there is just profound. A foundational First Amendment ruling emerged directly from a state-sponsored attempt to repress the press.
The system tried to stifle truth and ended up enshrining the right to report it. And conversely, segregationist leaders recognized the media's systemic role and tried to attack the messenger with rhetoric. Governor Ross Barnett of Mississippi was vocal, claiming the entire turmoil was a sinister illusion created by television itself.
That's a classic defense mechanism of a threatened system, isn't it?
Right.
Attack the messenger.
It is. Barnett argued that media bias was a smokescreen to hide the biggest power grab in American history, the concentration of power in Washington. It shows how the system, when confronted with undeniable visibility, attacks the mechanism of reporting when it can't control the message of protest.
And this brings us to the last, and maybe the most crucial insight for understanding systemic change. Legislation only followed disruption, not polite persuasion.
The initial Civil Rights Act, proposed by Kennedy, it really struggled for traction. It faced massive resistance. Major political change, as branch documents, only happened when the disruption became too costly for the federal government to tolerate politically, economically, or internationally.
You can see the stubbornness of that local system in places like Greenwood, Mississippi.
Oh, absolutely. When the Greenwood CFO office was burned down, local officials defended their actions against federal representatives. They viewed any concession to Washington as spineless surrender that proved a naked political sword from the Kennedy arsenal was at work. They resisted until the bitter end.
So it took an accumulation of visible, mortal trauma to finally shift the needle on voting rights.
It did. The national shift to demanding voting rights, specifically, the precursor to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it didn't happen after a smooth negotiation. It happened after the horrific violence and the triple murder of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner during Freedom Summer.
The brutal deaths of those three men, particularly the two white middle-class Northerners, suddenly changed the calculation for Washington.
It forced a national recognition that political inequality went much deeper than segregated schools and lunch counters. It was the mortal issue of voting by color, exposed through the high-profile deaths of activists, including white outsiders, that finally provided the necessary political catalyst for Congress. Disruption created a crisis that legislation was then required to solve.
That detailed analysis gives us the mechanisms. Now let's zoom out and explicitly map this system. Branch's book provides all the pieces, so let's put them together. Let's identify the actors, their incentives, and the feedback loops that drove this whole period.
Okay, let's map it. So first, the core groups. You have the activists, SCLC, SNCC, the NOI. They were the initiators of confrontation, the moral witnesses. King provided the strategic language. Moses and SNCC provided the dangerous groundwork.
Right. And on the other side, the direct opposition.
The local governments and police, your Bull Connors, your Sheriff Jim Clarks, they were the frontline enforcement mechanisms for the racial hierarchy, using law and terror to maintain segregation.
Then you have the complex and, as we've said, contradictory power, the federal officials. JFK, LBJ, the Justice Department, the FBI.
They're the ultimate arbiters of national law, but their job was so fraught because they had to balance their Cold War reputation against the massive domestic political risk of alienating the Southern Bloc in Congress.
Which explains the ambivalence and the surveillance. We also can't forget the media, the New York Times, CBS.
The vanguards of visibility. They carried the story, forced the crisis onto the national stage, and as we saw with the Sullivan case, they often faced legal and physical backlash for it.
And finally, operating in the shadows but with crucial institutional sanction, you have the white supremacist groups, the Klan, the Citizens Council.
Exactly. They provided the extra legal violence used to ensure institutional compliance with segregation, often with tacit approval or outright collusion of local law enforcement.
Okay, so let's talk incentives. What drove the behavior of the central actors, especially the federal government, to finally move?
Well, at the end of the day, it was political stability and electoral pressure. The critical turning point was LBJ's massive landslide victory in 1964. That gave him the political capital and the incentive to push through major legislation because he was no longer shackled by the need to secure a future nomination.
He had his mandate.
He had his mandate. And you see other figures like Adam Clayton Powell, key political players, sensing this grassroots uprising was just too big to ignore, so he decides to lead it, reinventing his own image to capitalize on the movement's momentum.
And the other major incentive, which you mentioned earlier, was the international stage, the Cold War.
International reputation was a constant external check on domestic inaction. News of starvation in Mississippi, in LaFleur County, where officials were denying food aid to impoverished black citizens, That was profoundly embarrassing to U.S. leadership.
The leader of the free world.
Exactly. They're trying to sell themselves as the leader of the free world in the fight against communism. And this external pressure pushed the federal government to intervene, for instance, by forcing those reluctant county supervisors to finally accept federal food aid.
Now let's map the competing narratives, because this is where the system fought its battles in the public sphere. And the segregationists were incredibly effective at framing their resistance, weren't they?
Their core narrative was law and order states' rights. Local officials framed activism as communist-inspired external agitation. They were protecting local authority from the federal dictatorship they claimed Washington was trying to impose. That narrative justified resistance as self-defense.
And King's strategy, built on confrontation, it centered on the nonviolent moral language narrative, appealing to the national conscience.
To redeem America from its internal contradictions. And then you have Malcolm X offering that third structural critique, militancy. He cultivated a powerful psychological alternative, providing an aura of violence that gave voice to those who had lost all faith in democratic means.
This clash of narratives and incentives, it created these powerful feedback loops. The system was kinetic, not static.
The most potent feedback loop was protest, repression, visibility, a federal response. We see this cycle perfectly in St. Augustine, Florida in 1964. You have protest demonstrations, arrests, including the high-profile arrest of the mother of the governor of Massachusetts.
Right.
That leads to fierce repression violence, mass arrests. This repression generates massive visibility media coverage, acute embarrassment for the federal government. And that embarrassment then triggers a federal response, political negotiations, and eventual intervention. The system only moved when the visible cost of repression exceeded the political cost of intervention.
That makes the mechanics crystal clear. But it raises a profound question. Why did local violence and systemic resistance persist even after a huge legislative victory like the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
This is the critical concept of institutional lag. National laws get passed, but the local power structures maintain control because they retain the incentives for violence. Legal reforms didn't immediately dismantle that system. Sheriff Jim Clark in Selma is the iconic example. The '64 Act passed, but he continued to use brutal, visible, non-lethal tactics, nightsticks, cattle prods, mass arrests to resist compliance.
So he wasn't necessarily killing people, but he was still creating that visible spectacle of violence.
Exactly. He was maintaining the segregationist hierarchy through terror and humiliation, and that required the next highly specific round of confrontations in 1965, the Selma campaign, to secure the Voting Rights Act. The '65 Act specifically targeted the systemic root of political inequality, aiming to remove the structural incentive that allowed men like Clark to operate with impunity.
So what does this deep dive into the systems of 63 to 65 help us understand about the structural challenges we face today? Let's talk about present-day implications, this idea of structural recurrence.
The book is just essential for understanding why legal reform does not automatically guarantee institutional compliance. The structures of resistance are so tenacious and adaptable. We see officials in Selma willing to spend months fighting over one single applicant to register. They just use bureaucratic resistance to delay and deny until the system is broken.
And Branch gives us that incredible example from LaFleur County where, after the federal government forced food aid, local officials tactically provided a courtesy bus to the courthouse.
So that black applicants could obtain rejections with less public friction.
That is the perfect illustration of systemic adaptation. The goal wasn't to comply with the spirit of the law, but to maintain the effect of denial while reducing a public embarrassment that had triggered federal intervention in the first place.
Exactly. The ultimate goal of the movement wasn't just a law in the books, but confronting these systems of entrenched power that resist compliance at every single turn.
Which raises an important question about rhetoric versus reality. How effective is moral language when you're dealing with systems of political power? Was King's appeal to conscience enough, or was it just a tool?
Moral language was strategically useful. It amplified the suffering witnessed by the media, giving the movement moral authority. But, as Branch shows, it was only effective when it was buttressed by profound political disruption. That meant going to jail, filling the courts, stopping commerce, and forcing a crisis that cost the government money and reputation.
And the book shows King himself having to strategically revise his moral demands to make them politically palatable to the existing power structure, especially the Johnson administration.
King's manuscript for his book on Birmingham initially proposed a Negro Bill of Rights, a demand for national redress for the economic burden of slavery and segregation. But after a lot of debate, he revised it to be more compatible with LBJ's broader, politically safer war on poverty. He changed it to a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged.
So he had to straddle this political tightrope, risking forfeiting what Branch calls powerful historical arguments about the economic cost of race in favor of framing the demands in a way that was politically achievable in that moment.
Yeah.
That's a structural compromise, isn't it?
It is a compromise necessary for political action within a resistance system. And finally, Branch shows us why reform movements fracture under sustained pressure. We've talked about the external price, but the internal cost of this confrontation was catastrophic for the people driving it.
The emotional and physical toll was immense, and it's often overlooked. It's easy to discuss strategy and systems, but then you read about James Bevel and Diane Nash raging in sorrow after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, contemplating becoming vigilantes.
Turning from nonviolence to a black Muslim option to answer the crime with deeds of equal magnitude. That's the profound human cost of this confrontation.
And the pressure that's necessary for reform, it internally fragments the movement's own structure.
Bob Moses returned from Africa years later, completely disillusioned by the toll and the internal politics. And that crucial SNCC Waveland meeting in late 1964, held right after the height of their legislative success, it completely broke down into internal conflicts over affiliations, the black-white problem, and who should be on staff. They had achieved historic legislative success, but the internal organization was nearing total collapse under the stress of that very victory.
Let's link these findings back explicitly to the core themes of our show, crisis and perception. What is the fundamental insight Branch provides about systems and morality?
I think the core insight is that systems are structurally indifferent to moral pleas. They are cold, logical entities that respond only to calculated, quantifiable political and economic pressure. The 1964 riots, for example, forced intervention, not because the rioters suddenly became morally sympathetic, but because the disruption was seen by the Johnson administration as the Achilles heel of their domestic tranquility strategy.
Intervention was forced by political cost, not by conscience.
Exactly. And this also perfectly highlights the irony we constantly see in the study of systems, the gap between law and justice.
Right.
The NYTV Sullivan case is the perfect encapsulation of this. A foundational ruling that expanded freedom of the press and protects public debate emerged from the state of Alabama trying to use civil law to repress activism. The law changed, but only as a byproduct of the struggle against injustice.
Proving that while a legal victory can be achieved, the struggle against systemic barriers remains long after the text is revised. And finally, the book shows us so clearly how perception shifts only when incentives change or the crisis is brought home.
For years, the profound repression and daily violence in the Deep South went unregarded by the wider country. Bob Moses often said that outsiders really didn't know and didn't have any way of understanding the depth of the systemic rot. It was only the cumulative pounding of distant news and, crucially, the murder of white volunteers during Freedom Summer, which made the system's violence touch a new, visible demographic, that the country truly came alive to the issues. Perception followed tragedy because tragedy altered the political calculus in Washington.
So, to summarize what Pillar of Fire helps us see differently about this transformative era. First, social change is achieved not through idealism alone, but through highly calculated, dangerous, and strategic confrontation, what King called the calculated leap. It's an engineering feat.
Second, state violence served a clear institutional purpose. Whether through the explicit terror of the Klan or the systematic humiliation of prison life, the shorn hair, the sweatbox, it was the primary accepted mechanism for enforcing racial hierarchy.
And third, the cost of reform was immense, forcing deep moral, political, and personal fractures within the movement and among its leaders. From King facing FBI surveillance to Malcolm X defying Elijah Muhammad to SNCC dissolving into conflict, the system extracts a high price for change.
And this leaves us with a necessary, provocative thought, drawing on that analogy from Bob Moses about the deeper structural problem he saw the movement confronting. He said, "The country isn't willing yet to admit it has the plague, but it pervades the whole society." The progress of 1963-65, secured at such a high cost, reminds us that the struggle against entrenched systems is never complete because the foundational issues persist just beneath the surface of legal reform. Progress requires calculating confrontation because systems will not yield merely to a moral appeal.
That was Taylor Branch's Pillar of Fire, America in the King Years 1963-65, a truly epic and essential look at the mechanics of power and resistance.
We highly encourage you to read the book or borrow it from a library.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini-explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.